I've played a lot of MMORPGs, especially in the past few years, and I don't suggest you do the same because it's already investing enough of your time to play one or two, and you've got better things to do like make sure you cook dinner for the family, study for exams, or make your third Reddit account so you can stealth post another tier list in the MMORPG subreddit.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Everyone loves a good old tribalistic tier list to get self-validation on the game they've invested in, but after seeing so many of these, it gets tiring. Many of the MMORPG tier lists you'll see put all the same games at the top of the list. You've got your most popular games in the A and B tiers, and then everything else in the bad tier. And while I don't disagree with their conclusions, I do disagree with the presentation. Yes, we all know what the best MMORPGs are by now, but where do you start if you're looking for a specific experience, but don't have the time to sink hundreds of hours to determine whether or not it's the type of game you want? So I decided to split the tier list into the 5 most important aspects to an MMORPG. The combat, since that's what you'll be experiencing quite often in the game. The open world, if exploration is fun and you can get immersed in the game's setting. The story, even though MMORPGs aren't known for having good story. Then what kind of endgame challenges or progression systems there are to keep you engaged with the game and your character's growth. And of course the PvP, because what good is a multiplayer game if you can't settle your disagreements with the tried and true trial by combat. I also chose these specific MMORPGs because it keeps the list concise enough to prevent an hour-long video, but still providing a diverse array of the best games for someone looking for something new to play, but they need more specific feature comparison. Note that these are the most popular MMORPGs, so none of these games are completely bad, but they just might lack in some areas. No game is perfect for everyone, and you can still enjoy one category even if it's worse compared to another. Also, the games listed to the left in each tier are considered better, so there will be a clearly best game for each category. So let's start out with open world. Again, this is the ability to immerse you in the game and how exploration is handled. Albion Online is mostly a PvP MMO. There are hundreds of zones with not much clear direction, so exploration is fine and you get rewarded for doing so. But it's not the most densely packed zones because the game kind of expects you to find PvP content, so we'll give that a C tier. Black Desert Online has a very massive open world with many diverse biomes. However, the exploration is stunted because you're encouraged to autopath everywhere you go and the quests are extremely forgettable. One thing it does do well is that it limits fast traveling, which is a problem in many other MMOs because you don't really get to enjoy the scenery because you're always skipping past them. You really get to enjoy the scope of the world. So I thought that was done pretty well, but we'll give this still a A. Elder Scrolls Online has the questing formula that's always been appreciated by the majority of gamers, and the MMO captures that aspect well from the single player games. Also, getting to visit all the locations from the single player games all amalgamated into one game's map just makes an even more amazing and immersive experience, so we'll put that in the S tier. Final Fantasy XIV has a developed world that is immersive, but because most of the leveling process is slow and linear because you're just following the main storyline, exploration isn't very much the focus, so put this in B tier. Guild Wars 2 open world events are some of the best experiences of the game as they create cause and effect situations that change your experience on the map, and these can often culminate in meta events where you'll see many other players working towards resolving the same conflicts. Also, mounts are designed so well that they become part of how you traverse the terrain to make it enjoyable to travel somewhere. Lord of the Rings Online has the entire Tolkien lore to draw from, and many players will play this game just to visit the locations from the book, even though they're not interested in the RPG mechanics. Also, unlike many other MMORPGs, playing any race besides a human gives just as good of an experience, if not better, because each race, like the dwarves and elves, have long-standing histories to get immersed in, and this makes the leveling process very unique, for whatever kind of story or character you choose. So we'll put that above Guild Wars 2 but below Elder Scrolls. Now Lost Ark has very bad open world. There's a lot of collections and zones to visit, but for the most part you don't really need to meet other players out there because it's all solo content and it's very forgettable content. It also forces you into this content because the daily system is extremely long and you need to spend a lot of time gearing up your characters by doing this. So we'll put that as D tier. Maple Story's open world isn't great. The 2D maps aren't the worst, but it's not the most conducive to a exploration experience. So we'll put it in the C tier here. New World's open world is pretty good. You could be out gathering materials and just the scenery and the sound design could immerse you in the game. It's one of the newer MMOs, so the realistic graphics and other technologies are definitely on the better side, and there's some very cool and diverse areas to explore, though it can at times seem a bit generic, so we'll put it below Black Desert. Old school RuneScape has many dangerous caves and dungeons to explore across many different regions, and the risk of punishment on death adds to the immersion of dangerous areas that a lot of MMORPGs kind of miss out on nowadays because the leveling process is so streamlined that there's really no risk of dying. So RuneScape does that pretty well, but the fact that the graphics are so dated and the tile-based movement isn't really conducive to the feeling of exploration will only put that in the B tier. Star Wars The Old Republic has many different planets you can visit, such as the cyberpunk city of Nar Shaddaa, the ancient deserts of Tatooine, which have so many cool and flavorful details that help to immerse you in the world. Also, the side quests aren't just fetch quests. A lot of the time they interact with the deep lore and world building, so you get rewarded with more attachment to the world while leveling or progressing your characters. So that goes probably in the S tier. Throne and Liberty has really good graphics, and while this game has not been released in the West at the moment, it has been in the East, and since then I've played the closed and open beta for this game, and it's not the greatest lore or storytelling, but the exploration does feel pretty good due to the visuals and the shape-shifting, which allows you to traverse the diverse environments and biomes from many different perspectives. So we'll put this below New World. And finally, World of Warcraft. While Classic WoW has some of the best open world content, which is basically the 1 to 60 journey is like an entire adventure, Retail WoW has kind of numbed this experience a bit by the sharding system, which has turned it into a more single player experience. It's still good because there's so many expansions and zones to explore, but it's just not the best anymore. So we're going to give that the top of A tier. Now with all of them rated, I have to give the best open world to Elder Scrolls Online because of how large and complete the game's map is, but also because of how the champion point system works, which is essentially a global leveling system. That means you get relevant rewards for exploring and doing quests, which makes it feel really good because you can just play and do whatever you want or pursue whatever story is interesting you, and you'll still get rewarded for it. The next category is combat. I prefer more action-based combat, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the best because you might prefer more slow-paced or strategic combat, or you might not want skill-based combat because you don't want to put in much effort while still completing the content. That's fine and everyone has their opinions, but these are mine. Albion Online's combat is click to move with a small set of skills that you get from your weapons and armor equipped. It's a bit more strategic than action based, but it does feel very good because of how reactive the animations are. So we're going to give the combat a B tier. Black Desert Online's combat is one of the best. You do need to remember skill combos because they're not shown on like a skill bar. So that can be tough to get used to at first, but once you do get that muscle memory for what your skills are, all the animations are so amazing. All the classes have very distinct animations, and there's quick, fluid action combat that's fun enough that people just enjoy sitting there grinding mobs for hours. And if you're willing to sit there, then you don't have an issue with the keybinds because you'll get that practice. So put that in the S tier. Many people did not like the animation canceling aspect of Elder Scrolls Online's combat, but to me it felt pretty good when I got used to it. It's very weighty and immersive due to how much control you have over your character, such as the ability to stun break, dodge, so it's a very good action combat system. It's just maybe a little bit dated, so we'll give it the top of B tier. Final Fantasy XIV has many diverse classes that have distinct and viable playstyles, but the adherence to a global cooldown, which is over 2 seconds long, makes the combat feel very slow, and the fact that everything is balanced around this global cooldown makes everything kind of feel the same even though the classes are very distinct, so we'll give it the bottom of B tier. Guild Wars 2's action and tab targeting hybrid combat system allows every skill to have its own distinct animation. If you see a fireball shot at you, you can move out of the way, or if a hammer is about to drop down on you, you can dodge it. This combined with how much potential movement the player has creates some of the most immersive combat because you have so many options for how to play, and it creates a lot of player progression to learn and get better at new playstyles. So we'll put this at the top of S tier. Lord of the Rings combat is a very dated tab targeting system that is slow and not very visually appealing, so we'll probably put this in the D tier. While Lost Ark's combat is top down and click to move, which I'm not a fan of, it still has some of the best feeling classes, skill combos, and it has very meaningful and impactful combat. So I would probably give Lost Ark an A. Most people would probably give it an S, but I think it's just not the best because of click to move, but that's just me. Maple Story's combat is not bad for a 2D MMORPG. It's actually pretty fun, and if you enjoy old school platformers, you might actually enjoy it, though it's a comparison to Final Fantasy XIV and Elder Scrolls combat. We still have to give that something lower, so we'll put that in the C tier. New World's combat can be somewhat clunky and simplistic, but the weighty and immersive animations feel great. I'd compare it to Elden Ring, where there aren't many actions you can perform and the mobility is limited, which for some can be too slow, but it results in meaningful positioning and timing for a more tactical action combat, so that's probably in A tier below Lost Ark. Old school RuneScape's combat is definitely not visually appealing. However, there's a lot of complexity to it with how certain damage types and defense types counter each other like a rock paper scissors system, and also everything's on an internal clock, which turns RuneScape at higher levels into a very strategic rhythmic game. It's definitely an acquired taste, but I also don't like that there's a lot of menu management in the combat, which can feel really unimmersive, so we're going to put that below MapleStory. Star Wars The Old Republic is a dated tab targeting system with the hero engine, which many people dislike. It has extremely floaty animations, which means what's happening on screen doesn't necessarily match how you're thinking or feeling in the moment. You also get companions, which minimizes the relevancy of your actions in combat while in the leveling process. Otherwise, the game is just kind of boring in the combat, even though I do love the lightsaber animations, so we'll give it the C tier. Throne and Liberty's combat is very bad, which is a shame because it looks good, but when you get to playing it, it just feels terrible. And that's because it's a hybrid action and tab targeting system. However, it is a action combat system in which there are tab targeting skills rather than the Guild Wars 2 system, which is a tab targeting system with action combat skills. So what this means is, even though there's no global cooldown, it feels like there is because you never know when your skills are hitting based on your animations, so there's a disconnect there. Also, when an enemy runs out of range of your attack, it's not like your attack is just going to miss because it was out of range. It's just going to create an error, which means that you don't even perform the attack at all, which really makes it clunky and hard to get immersed in. So this is probably one of the worst combats I've ever seen. If we're talking about classic WoW, the combat can be a bit simplistic and slow paced, but if we're talking about retail WoW, then the classes become much more fleshed out and combat is a faster paced tab targeting that feels a lot more engaging. But the combat is ruined by the reliance on add-ons or too much UI that clutters the screen. Yes, it's possible to avoid them, but anyone who wants to get into PvP or endgame PvE will need to see the buffs and debuffs on every target, which even with the default settings can become too cluttered. So I'd probably give it the top or below Elder Scrolls. It's in the B tier. Now obviously the best combat is going to go to Guild Wars 2. The hybrid action and tab targeting creates a perfect balance of strategical precision and reactive counterplay. For some people, this makes the combat harder to play because there are so many different skills to learn instead of one global cooldown, but there are easy options that forego most positioning requirements. It's very impressive when you hear people say that they always come back to Guild Wars 2 just for the combat. And now for the endgame PvE. This is dungeons, raids, any kind of challenging content that provides you a reason to level up your characters further and keep playing after you finish the story or leveling process. Albion Online has farming and crafting in the end game. Other than this, there are some PvE challenges like dungeons. They're called hardcore expeditions, and their difficulty scales up as you take on higher levels. They don't have unique rewards, so players often have to make a decision if it's worth their time, because they could be getting more rewards somewhere else with a less difficult activity, which kind of hurts the population of players who do want to play this content. So this might be a C or D tier. Black Desert Online has some cool open world boss fights like the Leviathan you can fight at sea with a fleet of ships, but there aren't really dungeons or challenging group content. The endgame incentives are mostly just grinding, and while there is plenty of grind, you pretty much do the same thing as you always did, so just kill mobs or go fishing. I'll put this either bottom of B tier or top of C tier. For now, we'll just put it in the C tier. Elder Scrolls Online has more difficult veteran dungeons and trials, which are just raids with a Holy Trinity role system. But this doesn't get too complicated. You essentially just need to dodge, interrupt, and not have bad positioning, and you'll be able to complete most content. But you'll be farming champion points, which are ways to improve all characters on your account after max level. And you can pretty much do anything in the game, which allows you to decide what's fun for you and make that your end game. So it's pretty average. Final Fantasy XIV raids scale up to some of the most challenging content in any MMORPG, and trials, which are basically single boss encounters, have engaging mechanics, meaningful rewards, and impact the game's story. Although the leveling process is extremely long, getting into the endgame is made very accessible for the average player because the entire game is designed with a progression system that teaches you raids before throwing you into the deep end. And this keeps the pool of players who do endgame raids healthy enough to support a more hardcore raiding scene, or just groups who want to make progress towards clearing challenging content. So this is definitely top tier. Guild Wars 2 has raids and other challenging group content, but because there's no vertical progression, the only reason to do these after your first clear is for a specific skin, or just to grind gold, which allows you to get more fashion, which is the true endgame incentive. So there's tons of achievements and rewards to go for that give you those new skins, but if you're not interested in those skins, there's not much motivation to keep playing, which hurts the population for those who do want to. So we'll put this in the B tier. Lord of the Rings has older raids that become irrelevant and outdated, so the endgame content is pretty much doing a few raids or going on the leveling journey again, but with a different character. So this is not amazing. Put that in the C tier. Lost Ark has some of the most engaging and difficult raids in any MMORPG. The only issue is that the leveling curve is so steep that the only relevant raid tier is the current one, which means it can be difficult to find groups if you're returning to the game or starting as a new player. But they recently came out with solo raids, which can somewhat solve that issue. So we'll put this in the top tier. MapleStory has a max level of 300, and each class learns new skills and goes down branching paths as you level up, so there's plenty of grind and stuff to do in the game. Character progression is very rewarding, and there are plenty of boss fights and a lot of grind if you like that, so this is an A tier for sure. While New World's endgame used to be very barren, they've since launch added challenging group content, but this is still not the best as it needs more time to grow, so we'll put that below Black Desert Online. RuneScape's endgame can almost be considered their leveling process because it takes so long to get to level 99 on some of your skills. There's also some of the most challenging bosses and raid encounters in any MMORPG, and even with the limited combat capabilities, the encounters are so well designed to get the full potential out of what used to be a point-and-click browser game. However, most of the endgame is kind of just sitting there and grinding while you're kind of half AFK. So I'd put this in the A tier with MapleStory, which is kind of similar with how the grind works, but we'll put it above MapleStory. Star Wars: The Old Republic has dungeons and raids at the endgame, which are pretty easy to get into, but there are also harder difficulties that will require you to understand the fight mechanics and how to optimize your role in the holy trinity of tank, healer, and DPS. However, these aren't actively developed, so while you need to learn and find a community that wants to progress these challenges, there isn't much of an ecosystem or reason to do so other than skins. So that's pretty much the same as Guild Wars 2, we'll put it below though. While Throne and Liberty is still a relatively new game and it takes a while for endgame PvE to be developed, there were some cool mechanics that I saw in the solo and group content during the betas, which leads me to believe that the endgame PvE can be great, but since it's not too fleshed out, I can only say that it's okay, so we'll put that below New World. World of Warcraft has good raids in both classic and retail that have meaningful rewards and implications for the game's story, but the mythic dungeons in retail are probably the most popular aspect of endgame PvE, and they're so addicting because they create a challenging 5-man experience that changes depending on the current week. It scales difficulty and rewards infinitely, although in practice you can't go infinitely, though it fosters a speedrunning community because of the time constraints that promote constant optimizing of strategies, which I'm not too into myself personally, but I still enjoy the challenge that it creates for the average player. So this has got to go in the top tier. If I only wanted to play raids, I'd probably put Final Fantasy XIV at the top, because World of Warcraft has too much reliance on add-ons, while Final Fantasy XIV bans them. But WoW has mythic dungeons, which are the most fun and replayable PvE system I've ever experienced, so I still gotta give the best endgame PvE to WoW. Next is PvP, and the standard for good PvP is pretty low in MMORPGs because balance and activity is hard to manage when there are so many factors. If you only want PvP, it's usually better to just play a purely PvP game like a MOBA or one of the Battle Royale shooters. But even if it's not the main focus of the game, it's important for these massively multiplayer games to have PvP because it's nice to be able to blow off some steam or to experience your character's skills and strengths in a different format to help you grow. Albion Online is a PvP focused game and has full loot PvP, so the economy is built into the politics or behaviors that the players create, which makes dying or killing other players meaningful beyond the intrinsic value of experiencing those fights. There's also some PvP arenas where you can do team-oriented, objective-based PvP without losing your gear, so you can relax without the risk when you want to just play. So this is definitely A tier. Black Desert Online has open world PvP, guild versus guild battles, and even though there's steep vertical progression, player skill can overcome pay to win, and rivalries between players or guilds often create emergent content. If you want more fair PvP, there's also the 3v3 arena seasons, which aren't always open, but when they are, you can climb to the top rated team and prove your skill due to the normalized gear in the Arena of Solaire. So this is definitely top tier PvP. Elder Scrolls Online has instanced PvP, which is mostly casual with a few game modes on a few different maps. Gear matters, so it's not the most balanced, but it's still fun, and you can progress your champion points in PvP as well, so you can just play that as long as you like, still get rewarded for it. There's also more open world PvP with the Cyrodiil map, where you can engage in massive siege battles to gain or defend territory, and the Imperial City, which is like a semi-looter mode where you can earn or lose rewards based on getting kills. So this is definitely good, it's fleshed out. I would give this either an A in the low A or maybe a top B. We'll just put it top B for now. Final Fantasy XIV's PvP is pretty bad, due to the balancing of PvP, basically dumbing down the classes. You shouldn't lose complexity for going into PvP. If anything, you should get more complexity. You can still get rewards and have fun in the different game modes like the payload or capture points, especially if you already enjoy other aspects of the game, but you definitely don't play Final Fantasy XIV for the PvP. Guild Wars 2 PvP arenas are not very popular anymore due to the lack of content and incentives that eventually led to a downfall in population, but the fast nature of matches and the ability to jump into PvP with no need for leveling or grind can be very addicting. More players enjoy the open world PvP in the world versus world game mode because of the server politics and freedom to play for the objectives or not. Because winning isn't incentivized that much, players can find it boring, but others keep playing it because it's the best way to experience the full extent of the engaging combat systems and classes. So we'll put that above Elder Scrolls Online in the B tier. In Lord of the Rings Online, you really can't fight other players than a 1v1 duel. There are, however, areas where you can play as a monster and groups of monsters can fight against groups of players, but being able to play as a monster is tied to a VIP status, which you have to pay for, so this is probably one of the worst PvP games. Lost Ark's PvP is just very bad. It has an underdeveloped PvP game mode, and it has a stagger system that is just a worse version of Black Desert Online, so it's not fun to play, and I'd put this below Final Fantasy XIV for sure. MapleStory's PvP, I believe, was removed from the game for balancing reasons, so it just doesn't exist, and for some people that could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing that you actually want to play PvP, but it just doesn't exist, so we gotta put that at the bottom of D tier, right? New World's open world PvP isn't the most popular anymore because you can just toggle PvP off and not be hostile to other players, but there are large 20v20 objective-based battles over outposts, there's 3v3 arenas, and while the PvP isn't that balanced, that's basically every MMO, and that's what makes it fun, and it's one of the main reasons players will play New World, so we'll put that at the top of A tier. RuneScape has the Wilderness, which is a high-risk, high-reward zone where other players can kill you and take your loot, but you can also find more valuable treasures and quests out there. However, most players don't want to risk the items they grinded for unless they're dedicated player killers. For others who want a less risky but still engaging PvP experience, there are game modes with specific rewards and events to promote players to get into a certain game mode and make it feel alive during the event. I really enjoyed the Castle Wars when I played it, so RuneScape is definitely decent PvP. I'd put it at the bottom of B tier. Star Wars The Old Republic's PvP is entirely casual since they removed the rank feature from arenas, and you can queue into pre-mades as a solo queuer, so there isn't much reason to take them seriously. You also spend a lot of time in PvP just being stunned or knocked around. You don't have much control of your character. Open world PvP isn't common anymore, but the war zones, which are like objective-based battlegrounds, and the Starfighter PvP are still fun and scratch the itch you might have once in a while, so this is C tier. While Throne and Liberty's combat is in my opinion bad, the PvP modes aren't bad. There's small-scale arenas, but also large-scale guild battles, which can even occur around boss events, forcing players to fight over the objective. This large-scale PvP has an economy that creates emergent, player-driven content that communities are built from. However, these events are based on a time schedule, and so you aren't guaranteed action at all times of the day if you only want to PvP. However, this does create a time zone where you can be guaranteed PvP if you arrive at that time. So it's definitely worse than Albion, but I don't think it's at the same tier as Albion. World of Warcraft Classic has some of the most engaging open world PvP because of how the Horde and Alliance faction system works, and the eventual conflicts that occur when fighting over resources such as quest objectives and farming spots. But other than Battlegrounds, which are fun, there isn't much structured PvP until you play Retail WoW, which has arenas. The issue with arenas is that you spend too much time stunned, even though there's a diminishing return on stuns, and while players still enjoy the strategic element of playing around cooldowns and kill windows, there's just too much of an emphasis on knowledge and experience rather than actual fun gameplay. So we've got to give this a bit higher than Throne and Liberty. I'll probably put it below Albion in the A tier. So with all the games ranked, we can clearly see that Black Desert Online is the best PvP MMORPG. And that's because it already has good combat, and then you tie that to various PvP modes that have a meaningful influence on the environment. In the past, there were issues with pay to win making PvP less meaningful, but with the addition of seasons, which essentially makes players create new characters and allows them to gear up a lot faster, it's leveled out the playing field in terms of vertical progression. And the Arena of Solaire has no gear difference, so it's become much less of a factor, and the fun and skillful aspects of the combat can really shine in Black Desert. The last category is going to be the story. Do the characters have meaningful progression, or are they just NPCs? Is the story interesting enough to motivate you to want to see the next part, or is it just a chore to get you to max level? Albion Online's story is pretty non-existent, but if you're someone who always skips the story and don't care for it, then this might actually be better for you. Black Desert Online's story is pretty bad. You don't really care for the characters at all, and most players just go through the motions when they're doing the story just to get to the next area. So, I mean, it exists, so it's got to be better than Albion Online, but it's still in the D tier. Elder Scrolls Online has many different expansions that allow you to travel to different regions and experience those stories. These DLCs have standalone, fully voice-acted stories, so you can experience them in the order you choose, but they're not the most interesting, even though they have a decent amount of character progression in them, so we'll put it in maybe A or top of B tier. Final Fantasy XIV's story is one of the best because the players get really invested in the character arcs because of how meaningful they are, and there's a ton of story to go through, which is all very high quality, so you're getting your money's worth. It's definitely a top tier MMORPG story. Guild Wars 2's story can be pretty good, and it's fully voice acted and replayable due to the story journal, but they're designed to be done very quickly to get you to a new map, so there isn't much story content there, so we'll put this in the B tier. The Lord of the Rings Online uses the same story as the movies and books, and while that story is very good, there's an issue because games are not the same medium as books or movies, and so the story has to be changed a bit, but since you can't really step on the feet or retcon the movies and books, there's a lot of limitations with how they can make the story in Lord of the Rings Online, so it's got to go below Elder Scrolls. Lost Ark's story is pretty bad. You just want to spam G to get through the dialogue, the characters are pretty forgettable, and the story is actually gated by item level, which means you'll be stuck at certain points until you do raids that might not be relevant, or grind dailies and island events, which aren't too engaging either. So if you're only interested in the story, you're going to have to do other things to get through it rather than having a seamless story experience like other MMORPGs would have. So this is definitely bottom tier. Maple Story has a traditional RPG story that isn't the focus of the game, but it's substantial enough to give you a reason to keep leveling up and see your class story. While it's not terrible, it is competing with other games that definitely have a higher budgeted and quality story, so I can only put it in the C tier. New World's story is kind of bad because the events of the story are not actually happening at the same time that you're experiencing them. It's kind of similar to Elden Ring, where you're reading text about events that aren't actively happening, and it's not really the most immersive, so really it's not the worst, but no one's really going to play the game for the story, so we'll put it in the C tier, below Maple Story. The quests in old school RuneScape are iconic, and it's still one of the best methods for storytelling in MMORPGs today. Many of these quests are gated by arbitrary skill requirements, so you can't just progress the story in one go. There's a bit of grind and exploration required in between, which to some might be a detriment, kind of like Lost Ark, but it's better because the gameplay elements are a lot more closely tied in to the story, unlike other games, where the story is just a dialogue simulator. So we're going to give RuneScape a B. Star Wars The Old Republic has very good story. They've been adding story content patches consistently throughout the game's lifecycle, and you can actually make decisions in the story on what kind of character you want to be. So your story is based on what class you choose, But if you're a Sith, which is naturally bad, you can choose to be more good. So there's a lot of decision making and player character progression in the story. And the story takes place thousands of years before the movies, so there's a lot of room for storytelling and new character arcs. This definitely is top tier story. Throne and Liberty has bad, skippable dialogue and unremarkable characters. It's your typical Eastern MMO that isn't Final Fantasy XIV. World of Warcraft Classic has essentially no main storyline. It's all just quest hubs, but some of the quest chains can tell engaging stories, and in retail WoW there's a lot of story and a high budget to it. But it gets worse and more convoluted the more expansions you play through. Even if you wanted to play through some of the older stories, they aren't available or have been forced into some kind of time travel justification, so we're going to put that below RuneScape. So the best story has got to be between Star Wars or Final Fantasy. If you're more into the RPG style story where you influence the outcome, then you're going to want to play Star Wars. But if you want the most polished experience, like reading a good fiction novel, the linear storytelling of Final Fantasy XIV is the best. But let's be honest, Final Fantasy XIV is massive, it's still in active development, and the story only gets better as time goes on, whereas SWTOR's story it's slowing down in development. So obviously Final Fantasy XIV is going to take the top here. Now, if I were to assign a number value to each of the rankings that I gave to each of the games, say for example, D is 1, C is 2, B is 3, A is 4, and S is 5, and we added up all the rankings that we gave them, we could create a overall tier list for all the features in a game. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that those 5 features are the only features. This is still somewhat simplified. You know, there's community and other aspects to a game, but let's just see how it works. So obviously I'm not going to put D as like 1 through 10 because then nothing's going to be in the D tier. So what we've done is we've put 11 through 12 as D tier, 13 to 14 as C, 15 to 16 as B, A is 17 to 18, and 19 to 20 is S. So this should give us a good differential between all the top MMORPGs. If we put every single MMORPG in here, then obviously these would be way better than all the others, right? So let's just start ranking them in terms of their points. So Albion Online was 11 points, so that's in the D tier. Black Desert Online was 18, so that's in the A tier. Elder Scrolls Online was 18, so that's also A tier. Final Fantasy XIV was 17, so that's in the A tier. Guild Wars 2 was 19, so that's in the S tier. Lord of the Rings Online got 13, so that's C tier. Lost Ark got 12, so that's D tier. MapleStory got 11, so that's also D tier. New World got 16, so that's B tier. RuneScape got 15, so that is lower than New World in the B tier. Star Wars The Old Republic got 17, so that is low on the A tier. Throne and Liberty got 11, so that is the bottom of D tier. And then World of Warcraft got 19, so that's tied with Guild Wars 2 in the S tier. So obviously you can see that Final Fantasy XIV maybe should be higher because, you know, most tier lists say that it's an S tier, but I think this is actually kind of accurate because the people who play Final Fantasy XIV love the story and they love the raids and they play it for that. So if you don't like that, then you're just not going to play Final Fantasy XIV at all. And that's why you'll actually see that Final Fantasy XIV is kind of a controversial thing because it's really good for some people, but then really bad for other people. And so that's why I kind of think that overall it kind of fits in the A tier, whereas things like World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 2, they have a more well-balanced and they kind of rank high in all areas. And that's why some people might not like them either because they don't want to play everything. They just want to focus on one thing. And for example, if you're only into PvP, well then Guild Wars 2 is not really your game. But if you're really into PvP, then Black Desert is, but that's lower. So you got to find out what the MMO that you prefer is based on the things that you prefer. And that's not to say that you need to only specialize in one category. Some people love MMOs for all the different things that they offer. But hopefully this was helpful to you. If you did enjoy the video or it was helpful at all, then please like the video, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.